Okay, hello and welcome. This is your teacher Esteban here. And before I start with the video, I wanted to let you guys know that I decided to make this video because we didn't have class because of freshman week, and I felt that my section maybe needed a little bit of content review and reinforcement. I really wanted to do great on the test, so I have made this video to help you a bit. But a tip of advice, please review all the content that you have to review, read all the chapters that you have to read, have a look at the questions presented on those texts, have a look at the questions presented on the materials that we have reviewed in class, and study. The contents of this video are not going to be all the contents that are going to be evaluated within the written evaluation. So this is just extra supplementary material for you to study. Okay. Now, without more ado, let's start with the video. So, student assessment is, a critical aspect of the teaching and learning process. Whether teaching at the undergraduate or graduate level, it is important for instructors to strategically evaluate the effectiveness of their teaching by measuring the extent to which students in the classroom are learning the course material. Assessing is the systematic collection and analysis of information to improve a student's learning. This definition captures the essential task of a student assessment in the teaching and learning process. Student assessment enables instructors to measure the effectiveness of their teaching by linking student performance to specific learning objectives. As a result, teachers are able to institutionalize effective teaching choices and revise ineffective ones in their pedagogy. And as we have mentioned in class, for the purpose of our course, we have identified 5 dimensions of assessment. I want you to have a look at those. The first one being why assess. And by the way, these dimensions, they do refer to mental activity that results in decisions being made and actions being taken. So that's why these 5 different questions exist, right? Because that's what we want to accomplish. We want to find questions. We want to find questions because we want to make decisions. So the first dimension would be why assess. Why do we assess? What effects or outcomes are expected to produce? The second question is what to assess, deciding what we look for as instructors. What kinds of content knowledge am I expecting students to demonstrate, and at what level? Are there professional skills or attitudes that I expect students to develop in my course? So keep in mind that a test or an assignment is a valid measurement only if it will elicit from your students the kind of learning you want to measure. And let me show you this figure, which shows some examples of various kinds of learning that can be assessed in university courses. Factual knowledge, application skills, problem-solving skills, conceptual understanding, creativity, critical reflection, professional skills, etc. Okay. Now, the next dimension would be how to assess. Selecting the type of assessment, activities, exercises, etc. Selecting the type of questions we're going to use in a particular test in relation to learning objectives. Number 4, how to interpret, which is understanding the outcomes of the information and impressions we gather through assessment. we should give meaning to the raw events of assessment. So now we've come to the final dimension of assessment, how to respond. In a way, this is basically that now that we've gathered information and we have already interpreted that information, it's time for us to decide what do we do with that information. Find appropriate ways of expressing our responses to whatever has been assessed and of communicating it to the person concerned, right? Now, okay, so academics like to use metaphors when we talk about assessments. We often talk about assessments as milestones or gateways, for example. And the message that comes through very strongly when we use such concepts is that assessments are something to be gotten past, something external to the student that the student must overcome in a way. And I want to suggest a different way of conceiving assessment as windows. To think about assessment as windows is to treat them as opportunities to see what the student is doing and how the student is doing. Okay, now let's talk about types of assessments. We have formative assessments and summative assessments. Formative assessments, within formative assessments, we have pre-assessment and ongoing assessment. So for pre-assessment, the idea is to find out before learning cycle, diagnostic in nature, never graded. Although we know that sometimes teachers they do grade this formative types of assessments, but most of the time they do not share the grades with their students, right? And then we have ongoing assessment, which is also formative, which is about checking up along the way. It happens at various points during learning cycle and sometimes it can be graded. And other type of assessment that we have is summative, right? Summative, making sure it happens at the end of the learning cycle. So we have these two main type of assessment. Each of them happen at different points in the learning process. Formative, which occurs both before and during the learning process, and then summative, which happens at the end of key segments in a learning cycle or at the end of the learning process. Right? Now that we have checked some of the contents of assessments, let's have a little bit of a quiz. No, we're not going to have the quiz just yet. Okay, sorry. Sorry, I forgot. We need to talk about families of assessment purposes, standardized assessment versus classroom assessments, and after that we're going to have the quiz. Yeah, I'm sorry. So we have we have two different families of assessments: standardized assessments and classroom assessments. So for standardized assessments, we have aptitude, proficiency, and placement. Aptitude being very general, designed for all students interested in studying foreign languages for purposes of measuring overall abilities to learn languages. Then we have proficiency assessment, also very general, designed for all students of a particular language for purposes of measuring the relative overall abilities in that language. And then we have placement assessment, designed for measuring the language abilities of the students who are already part of an institution so they can be put in the appropriate level of language study. This happens a lot at college level and institution level too. Then within the spectrum of classroom assessments, we have diagnostic information, progress, and achievement. So diagnostic information administered at the beginning of the course, designed for gauging individual students' strengths and weaknesses with regard to the specifics of a course. Sometimes we teachers, based on the information that we gather through a diagnostic assessment, we need to go back and we need to change lesson plans. We need to change the contents of the course based on the information that we gather because of this. But only if we have time to do so. This is a very complicated topic, I would say. Okay, we have progress assessment administered in the middle of a course, designed for measuring students' progress with respect to the objectives, points addressed in a particular language course. And finally, achievement, administered at the end of a course, designed for evaluating how much students have accomplished with respect to the objectives in a particular language course. We've been talking about assessment. We haven't been talking about evaluation just yet, but let's have a look at this chart, which is a comparison between evaluation versus assessment in terms of meaning, nature, what it does, purpose, and orientation. Assessment is a process of collecting, reviewing, and using data for the purpose of improvement in the current performance. So that is assessment. And on the other hand, evaluation is described as an act of passing judgment on the basis of a set of standards. So that's why they're very different from each other in education. Only in education, because assessment and evaluation are usually synonyms, and I could use these two concepts interchangeably in everyday parlance, right? Everyday parlance, I mean everyday conversation. Assessment and evaluation are distinct in nature because assessment is diagnostic, whereas evaluation is judgmental. What it does: assessment provides feedback on performance and areas of improvement. And evaluation determines the extent to which objectives are achieved given a pre-established criterion. Okay? The purpose of assessment is formative, and most of the time, purpose of evaluation is summative. And the final point here, which is very important, remember this: assessment is process-oriented, whereas evaluation is product-oriented. And that would be one of the most important distinctions between these two concepts. Assessment and evaluation, both being different from each other, also have something in common. Both assessment and evaluation require data, evidence to make decisions. They are user-oriented, and they both require certain criteria to be applied. Now, let's have a quiz. I want you to do this. I want you to pause the video for a minute, have pen and paper available, and I just need you to follow the instructions to answer the questions and solve the exercises presented. Okay, so pause the video and go get your things. Now, let me continue, and this is going to be the first part of the quiz with 21 points, by the way, each one of the questions being 1 point, if you want to know how many points you got. So this is a matching exercise. Make sure that you match the concept with its proper definition. So pause the video and do this. Now that you have done the exercise, let's check your answers. So number 1, how to interpret. Number 2, how to respond. Number 3, how to assess. Number 4, what to assess. And finally, why assess. Did you get them right? Did you get them wrong? Did you even do them? I hope that you got them, all of them right. I think you did. This is not very difficult. Now I have a chart here, which is the comparison between assessment and evaluation. Some information is there. And what we have there is basis for comparison in terms of meaning, nature, what it does, purpose, and orientation. For each one of the of these for each one of these boxes with information, I want you to fill in the gaps, right? Very, very easily. So pause the video and just continue when you're ready. Now, these are the answers for the chart. If this is the information that you got, then you got all of the information right. And very simple, 2 different types of assessment. just fill in the blanks with the information that you need. That was a gift. Very, very easy, right? Formative assessment versus summative assessment. You also now have to fill in the blanks with the right information regarding assessments. I was I was going to wait for you to finish the activity, but you can always pause the video, right, and then continue. So these are the answers. We have aptitude, proficiency, and placement. And of course for standardized assessments. Standardized assessments, as opposed to, this is where you complete with the information, you pause the video, and then you come back, and that would be the answer. Those would be the answers for those questions. Diagnostic information, progress, achievement for classroom assessments. Okay, now that we're done with that, let's continue with the next topic of our conversation today, which is going to be assessing reading. So the goal of reading assessments is to provide feedback on the skills, processes, and knowledge resources that represent reading abilities. Since the process of reading is not directly observable, reading assessments are based indirectly on what are commonly believed to be the component subskills. These subskills are in turn associated with prevailing models of how people process written information. I'm not going to cover the component subskills. All that information is available for you on the reading chapters that you have. And if I had to explain like all the different subskills, that would take me like 2 hours, so I cannot do that. But you have all that information available in your material, right? So let's have a look at the two different approaches. Bottom-up model versus top-down model, right? So bottom-up processing happens when someone tries to understand language by looking at individual meanings or grammatical characteristics of the most basic units of the text. Example, sounds for listening or words for reading. And moves from these to trying to understand the whole text. Bottom-up processing is not thought to be a very effective way to approach a text initially, and it's often contrasted with top-down processing, which is thought to be more efficient. Asking learners to read aloud may encourage bottom-up processing because they would focus on words, on word forms, not on meaning. Now, top-down modal approach. Top-down processing of language happens when someone uses background information to predict the meaning of language they're going to listen to or read, rather than relying first on the factual words of sounds, bottom-up. They develop expectations about what they will hear or read, and confirm or reject these as they listen or read. Top-down processing is thought to be an effective way of processing language. It makes the most of what the person brings to the situation. Example, asking learners to predict what a newspaper article might be about from the headline or first sentence will encourage them to use top-down processing on the article. And now, in the classroom, by the way, students, learners, they can be encouraged to use both bottom-up and top-down strategies to help them understand the text. For example, in a reading comprehension, learners use the knowledge of the genre to predict what will be in the text. That would be top-down. And the understanding of asphyxiation to guess the meaning. That would be bottom-up. Now, I think that this is going to be... okay. Let me continue. Assessing listening, okay? So listening has often been described as the Cinderella skill. It is the language skill most teachers take for granted, and the skill many students have spent less time on actively developing. So the name Cinderella comes because Cinderella was abused and mistreated and usually ignored. So that's why Cinderella, because it's what usually happens with listening. Listening is usually forgotten. And well, it should not be like that because listening is actually one of the most important skills in language acquisition. It is the most important, more important than speaking, more important than writing, more important than speaking, because listening should be the very first encounter with language, which is, by the way, usually what didn't happen. What didn't happen when I was at school. I remember I was being 10 and I was so disappointed with my English lessons, with my first English lessons. Can you imagine that? I was 10 and I was already disappointed. I think I was not a very happy child. But then I would have my teacher writing down, typing down things on the board, and I had to repeat all those words. And it was very difficult for me to make sense of the words written on the board. It was just nonsense. Like, and my teacher didn't speak English because we didn't know how to speak English, so he never spoke English with us. And that was our first contact with the language, written words. And because we had written words, we would mispronounce those words in English all the time, all the time, all the time. So when it comes down to listening, we have three approaches of language learning: the discrete point approach, the integrative approach, and the communicative approach. Let's have a look at each one of them to make sense of them. So the discrete point approach, the focus of testing listening here is on the identification of isolated items of the language. Separate parts of the language are tested independently of each other. For instance, segmental phonemes, grammatical structures, vocabulary, all of them treated as separate entities. The type of tests that can be used with the discrete point approach are, for example, phonetic discrimination, paraphrase recognition, and responding appropriately to what was heard. So the assumptions with this type of approach to testing listening are that spoken text is the same as written text and that it can be isolated and tested as individual parts of the language. Okay. Integrative approach. The integrative approach attempted to move away from the discrete point approach, measuring of language item by testing more than just one item of language at a time. Therefore, integrative. The main difference between discrete point approach and integrative approach is that in the former, the product is the focus of the assessment. But for the integrative approach, the process is the most important part of assessment. Gap filling exercises, dictation, sentence repetition activities, statement evaluation, translation, all of them techniques mainly used with integrative approach. And finally, the communicative approach, the most praised approach, and within reasons, by the way. So the communicative approach is based on the idea that learning language successfully comes through having to communicate real meaning. That's when we talk about authenticity. Oh, by the way, please study. I'm not going to cover that authenticity, but please have a look at that, understand it, read it, do exercises, do your own research, okay? Because I'm not going to talk about authenticity, but important topic of the evaluation. So, communicative approach. The communicative approach is based on the idea that learning language successfully comes through having to communicate real meaning. When learners are involved in real communication, their natural strategies for language acquisition will be used, and this will allow them to learn to use the language. Example, practice in question forms by asking learners to find out personal information about their colleagues is an example of the communicative approach, as it involves meaningful communication, right? In the classroom, activities guided by the communicative approach are characterized by trying to produce meaningful and real communication at all levels. As a result, there may be more emphasis on skills than systems. Lessons are more learned centered and they may be use of authentic materials. Final words. Final words. What can I say? What I can say is there are some topics that I wanted to cover, but this video took me a long time. You don't know how many times I had to do it because I would make a mistake and I had to start all over again. So finally, this is over. So I apologize for that too, because I said that the video was going to be ready in the morning and then it wasn't. But then it's been a long way, rather than that, please study, check on the so many different topics that I didn't just have time to cover in this segment of the video. I didn't talk about reliability on education. I didn't talk about validity in education. I didn't talk about authenticity in education. And all of these are very important topics that you need to understand. You need to not only understand the concepts, but also you need to understand how to apply this knowledge into the classroom and different activities. So I hope that you have an excellent weekend. I hope the best for you guys, and I will be seeing you next week. Bye bye.